Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Western Canon Challenge, where we are reading the entirety of the Western literary canon out loud. Today we are continuing in Erewhon by Samuel Butler. We are on Chapter 8, entitled In Prison, and with that said, I'll get started. And now, for the first time, my courage completely failed me. It is enough to say that I was penniless and a prisoner in a foreign country where I had no friend nor any knowledge of the customs or language of the people. I was at the mercy of men with whom I had little in common. And yet, engrossed as I was with my extremely difficult and doubtful position, I could not help feeling deeply interested in the people among whom I had fallen. What was the meaning of that room full of old machinery which I had just seen, and of the displeasure with which the magistrate had regarded my watch? The people had very little machinery now. I had been struck with this over and over again, though I had not been for more than 24 hours in the country. They were about as far advanced as Europeans of the 12th or 13th century, certainly not more so. And yet they must have had at one time the fullest knowledge of our own most recent inventions. How could it have happened that, having been once so far in advance, they were now as much behind us? It was evident that it was not from ignorance. They knew my watch as a watch when they saw it, and the care with which the broken machines were preserved and ticketed proved that they had not lost the recollection of their former civilization. The more I thought, the less I could understand it, but at last I concluded that they must have worked out in their minds of coal and iron till either none were left, or so few that the use of these metals was restricted to the very highest nobility. This was the only solution I could think of, and though I afterwards found how entirely mistaken it was, I felt quite sure that it must be the right one. I had hardly arrived at this opinion for above 4 or 5 minutes when the door opened and a young woman made her appearance with a tray and a very appetizing smell of dinner. I gazed upon her with admiration as she laid a cloth and set a savory-looking dish upon the table. As I beheld her, I felt as though my position were already much ameliorated, for the very sight of her carried great comfort. She was not more than 20, rather above the middle height, active and strong, but yet most delicately featured. Her lips were full and sweet, her eyes were of a deep hazel, and fringed with long and sprigging eyelashes. Her hair was neatly braided from off her forehead. Her complexion was simply exquisite. Her figure as robust as was consistent with the most perfect female beauty, yet not more so. Her hands and feet might have served as models to a sculptor. Having set the stew upon the table, she retired with a glance of pity, whereon, remembering pity's kinsman, I decided that she should pity me a little more. She returned with a bottle and a glass, and found me sitting on the bed with my hands over my face, looking the very picture of abject misery, and, like all pictures, rather untruthful. As I watched her, threw my fingers out of the room again, I felt sure that she was exceedingly sorry for me. Her back being turned, I set to work and ate my dinner, which was excellent. She returned in about an hour to take away, and there came with her a man who had a great bunch of keys at his waist, and whose manner convinced me that he was the jailer. I afterwards found that he was the father to the beautiful creature who had brought me my dinner. I am not a much greater hypocrite than other people, and do what I would, I could not look so very miserable. I had already recovered from my dejection, and felt in a most genial humor, both with my jailer and his daughter. I thanked them for their attention towards me, and though they could not understand, they looked at one another and laughed and chattered till the old man said something on which I suppose was a joke, for the girl laughed merrily and ran away, leaving her father to take away the dinner things. Then I had another visitor, who was not so prepossessing, and who seemed to have a great idea of himself, and a small one of me. He brought a book with him, and pens and paper, all very English, and yet neither paper nor printing, nor binding, nor pen, nor ink were quite the same as ours. He gave me to understand that he was to teach me the language, and that we were to begin at once. This delighted me, both because I should be more comfortable when I could understand and make myself understood, and because I supposed that the authorities would hardly teach me the language if they intended any cruel usage towards me afterwards. We began at once, and I learnt the names of everything in the room, and also the numerals and personal pronouns. I found to my sorrow that the resemblance to European things, which I had so frequently observed hitherto, did not hold good in the matter of language, for I could detect no analogy whatever between this and any tongue of which I have the slightest knowledge, a thing which made me think it is possible that I might be learning Hebrew. I must detail no longer. From this time my days were spent with a monotony which would have been tedious but for the society of Uram, the jailer's daughter, who had taken a great fancy for me and treated me with the utmost kindness. The man came every day to teach me the language, but my real dictionary and grammar were Uram, and I consulted them to such purpose that I made the most extraordinary progress, being able at the end of a month to understand a great deal of the conversation which I overheard between Uram and her father. My teacher professed himself well satisfied, and said he should make a favorable report of me to the authorities. I then questioned him as to what would probably be done with me. He told me that my arrival had caused great excitement throughout the country, and that I was to be detained a close prisoner until the receipt of advices from the government. My having had a watch, he said, was the only damaging feature in the case, and then, in answer to my asking why this should be so, he gave me a long story, of which, with my imperfect knowledge of the language, I could make nothing whatever, except that it was a very heinous offense, almost as bad, at least so I thought I understood him, as having typhus fever. But he said he thought my light hair would save me. I was allowed to walk in the garden. There was a high wall, so that I managed to play a sort of hand-fives, which prevented my feeling the bad effects of my confinement, though it was stupid work playing alone. In the course of time, people from the town and neighborhood began to pester the jailer to be allowed to see me, and on receiving handsome fees, he let them do so. The people were good to me, almost too good, for they were inclined to make a lion of me, which I hated. At least the women were, only they had to beware of Uram, who was a young lady of a jealous temperament, and kept a sharp eye both on me and on my lady visitors. However, I felt so kindly towards her, and was so entirely dependent upon her for almost all that made my life a blessing and a comfort to me, that I took good care not to vex her, and we remained excellent friends. The men were far less inquisitive, and would not, I believe, have come near me of their accord, but the women made them come as escorts. I was delighted with their handsome mien and pleasant genial manners. My food was plain, but always varied and wholesome, and the good red wine was admirable. I had found a sort of wart in the garden, which I sweated in heaps, and then dried, obtaining thus a substitute for tobacco, so that what with Uram, the language, visitors, fives in the garden, smoking, and bed, my time slipped more rapidly and pleasantly than might have been expected. I also made myself a small flute, and being a tolerable player, amused myself at times with playing snatches from operas and airs such as "O Where and O Where" and "Home, Sweet Home." This was of great advantage to me, for the people of the country were ignorant of the diatonic scale, and could hardly believe their ears on hearing some of our most common melodies. Often, too, they would make me sing, and I could at any time make Uram's eyes swim with tears by singing Wilkins and his Dinah, Billy Taylor, the Rat-Catcher's Daughter, or as much of them as I could remember. I had 1 or 2 discussions with them because I never would sing on Sunday, of which I kept count in my pocketbook, except chants and hymn tunes. Of these I regret to say that I had forgotten the words, so that I could only sing the tune. They appeared to have little or no religious feeling, and to never have so much as heard of the divine institution of the Sabbath, so they ascribed my observance of it to a fit of sulkiness, which they remarked as coming over me upon the 7th day. But they were very tolerant, and one of them said to me quite kindly that she knew how impossible it was to help being sulky at times, only she thought I ought to see someone if it became more serious. A piece of advice which I then failed to understand, though I pretended to take it quite as a matter of course. Once only did Euram treat me in a way that was unkind and unreasonable. At least, so I thought it at the time. It happened thus. I had been playing fives in the garden and got much heated. Although the day was cold, for autumn was now advancing, and Cold Harbor, as the name of the town in which my prison was should be translated, stood fully 3,000 feet above the sea. I had played without my coat and waistcoat, and took a sharp chill on resting myself too long in the open air without protection. The next day I had a severe cold and felt really poorly. Being little used even to the lightest ailments, and thinking that it would be rather nice to be petted and cosseted by Euram, I certainly did not make myself out to be any better than I was. In fact, I remember that I made the worst of things, and took it into my head to consider myself upon the sick list. When Euram brought me my breakfast, I complained somewhat dolefully of my indisposition, expecting the sympathy and humoring which I should have received from my mother and sisters at home. Not a bit of it. She fired up in an instant and asked me what I meant by it, and how I dared to presume to mention such a thing, especially when I considered in what place I was. She had the best mind to tell her father, only that she was afraid the consequences would be so very serious for me. Her manner was so injured and decided, and her anger so evidently unfeigned, that I forgot my cold upon the spot, begging her by all means to tell her father if she wished to do so, and telling her that I had no idea of being shielded by her from anything whatever. Presently, mollifying, after having said as many biting things as I could, I asked her what it was that I had done amiss, and promised amendment as soon as ever I became aware of it. She saw that I was really ignorant, and had no intention of being rude to her. Whereon it came out that illness of any sort was considered in Erewhon to be highly criminal and immoral, and that I was liable, even for catching cold, to be had up before the magistrates and imprisoned for a considerable period, an announcement which struck me dumb with astonishment. I followed up the conversation as well as my imperfect knowledge of the language would allow, and caught a glimmering of her position with regard to ill health. But I did not even then fully comprehend it, nor had I as of yet any idea of the other extraordinary perversions of thought which existed among the Erewhonians, but with which I was soon to become familiar. I propose, therefore, to make no mention of what passed between us on this occasion, save that we were reconciled, and that she brought me surreptitiously a hot glass of spirits and water before I went to bed, as also a pile of extra blankets, and that next morning I was quite well. I never remember to have lost a cold so rapidly. This little affair explained much which had hitherto puzzled me. It seemed that the two men who were examined before the magistrates on the day of my arrival in the country had been given a charge on account of ill health, and were both condemned to a long term of imprisonment with hard labor. They were now expiating their offense in this very prison, and their exercise ground was a yard separated by my fives wall from the garden in which I walked. This accounted for the sounds of coughing and groaning which I had often noticed as coming from the other side of the wall. It was high, and I had dared not climb it for fear the jailers should see me and think that I was trying to escape. But I had often wondered what sort of people they should be on the other side, and had resolved on asking the jailer, but I seldom saw him, and Euram and I generally found other things to talk about. Another month flew by, during which I made such progress in the language that I could understand all that was said to me, and express myself with tolerable fluency. My instructor professed to be astonished with the progress I had made. I was careful to attribute it to the pains he had taken with me, and to his admirable methods of explaining my difficulties, so we became excellent friends. My visitors became more and more frequent. Among them there were some, both men and women, who delighted me entirely by their simplicity, unconsciousness of self, kindly, genial manners, and last but not least, by their exquisite beauty. There came others less well-bred, but still comely and agreeable people, while some were snobs, pure and simple. At the end of the third month, the jailer and my instructor came together to visit me and told me that communications had been received from the government to the effect that if I had behaved well and seemed generally reasonable, and if there could be no suspicion at all about my bodily health and vigor, and if my hair was really light, and my eyes blue and complexion fresh, I was to be sent up at once to the Metropolis in order that the king and queen might see me and converse with me, but that when I arrived there I should be set at liberty, and a suitable allowance would be made me. My teacher also told me that one of the leading merchants had sent me an invitation to repair to his house, and to consider myself his guest for as long a time as I chose. "He is a delightful man," continued the interpreter, "but has suffered terribly." From here came a long word which I could not quite catch, only it was much longer than kleptomania. "And has but lately recovered from embezzling a large sum of money under singularly distressing circumstances, but he has quite got over it, and the straighteners say that he has made a really wonderful recovery. You are sure to like him." Chapter 9. To the Metropolis. With the above words, the good man left the room before I had time to express my astonishment at hearing such extraordinary language from the lips of one who seemed to be a reputable member of society. "Embezzle a large sum of money under singularly distressing circumstances," I exclaimed to myself, "and ask me to go stay with him? I shall do nothing of the sort, compromise myself at the very outset in the eyes of all decent people, and give the death blow to my chances of either converting them, if they are the lost tribes of Israel, or making money out of them, if they are not. No, I will do anything rather than that." And when I next saw my teacher, I told him that I did not at all like the sound of what had been proposed for me, and that I would have nothing to do with it. For by my education and example of my own parents, and I trust also in some degree from inborn instinct, I have a very genuine dislike for all unhandsome dealings in money matters, though none can have a greater regard for money than I have, if it be got fairly. The interpreter was much surprised by my answer, and said that I should be very foolish if I persisted in my refusal. "Mr. Nosnibor," he continued, "is a man of at least 500,000 horsepower, for their way of reckoning and classifying men is by the number of foot-pounds which they have money enough to raise, or more roughly by their horsepower, and keeps a capital table. Besides, his 2 daughters are among the most beautiful women in Erewhon." When I heard all this, I confess that I was much shaken, and inquired whether he was favorably considered in the best society. "Certainly," was the answer. "No man in the country stands higher." He then went on to say that one would have thought from my manner that my proposed host had a jaundice or pleurisy, or been generally unfortunate, and that I was in fear of infection. "I am not much afraid of infection," said I impatiently, "but I have some regard for my character, and if I know a man to be an embezzler of other people's money, be sure of it, I will give him as wide a berth as I can, if he were ill or poor." "Ill or poor?" interrupted the interpreter, with a face of great alarm. "So that's your notion of propriety. You would consort with the basest criminals, and yet deem simple embezzlement a bar to friendly intercourse? I cannot understand you." "But I am poor myself," cried I. "You were," said he, "and you were liable to be severely punished for it. Indeed, at the council which was held concerning you, this fact was very nearly consigning you to what I should consider a well-deserved chastisement," for he was getting angry, and so was I. "But the queen was so inquisitive and wanted so much to see you, that she petitioned the king, and made him give you his pardon, and assign you a pension in consideration of your meritorious complexion. It is lucky for you that he has not heard what you've been saying now, or he would be sure to cancel it." As I heard these words, my heart sank within me. I felt the extreme difficulty of my position, and how wicked I should be in running counter to established usage. I remained silent for several minutes, and then said that I should be happy to accept the embezzler's invitation, on which my instructor brightened and said I was a sensible fellow. But I felt very uncomfortable. When he had left the room, I mused over the conversation which had just taken place between us, but I could make nothing out of it, except that it argued an even greater perversity of mental vision than I had been yet prepared for. And this made me wretched, for I cannot bear having much to do with people who think differently from myself. All sorts of wandering thoughts kept coming into my head. I thought of my master's hut and my seat upon the mountainside, where I had first conceived the insane idea of exploring. What years and years seemed to have passed since I had begun my journey. I thought of my adventures in the gorge and on the journey hither, and of Chowbuk. I wondered that Chowbuk told them about me when he got back. He had done well in going back, Chowbuk had. He was not handsome, nay, he was hideous, and it would have gone hardly with him. Twilight drew on, and rain pattered against the windows. Never yet had I felt so unhappy, except during 3 days of seasickness at the beginning of my voyage from England. I sat musing and in great melancholy until Euron made her appearance with light and supper. She too, poor girl, was miserable, for she had heard that I was to leave them. She had made up her mind that I was to remain always in the town, even after my imprisonment was over, and I fancy had resolved to marry me, though I had never so much as hinted at her doing so. So what with the distressingly strange conversation with my teacher, my own friendless condition, and Euron's melancholy, I felt more unhappy than I can describe, and remained so till I got to bed, and sleep sealed my eyelids. On awakening next morning, I was much better. It was settled that I was to make my start in a conveyance which was to be in waiting for me at about 11 o'clock, and the anticipation of change put me in good spirits, which even the tearful face of Euron could hardly altogether derange. I kissed her again and again, assured her that we should meet hereafter, and that in the meanwhile I should be ever mindful of her kindness. I gave her 2 of the buttons off my coat and a lock of my hair as a keepsake, taking a goodly curl from her own beautiful head in return. And so, having said goodbye 100 times till I was fairly overcome with her great sweetness and her sorrow, I tore myself away from her and got downstairs to the calash, which was in waiting. How thankful I was when it was all over, and I was driven away and out of sight. Would that I could have felt that it was out of my mind also. Pray heaven that it is so now, and that she is married happily among her own people, and has forgotten me. And now began a long and tedious journey with which I should hardly trouble the reader if I could. He is safe, however, for the simple reason that I was blindfolded during the greater part of the time. A bandage was put upon my eyes every morning, and was only removed at night when I reached the inn at which we were to pass the night. We traveled slowly, although the roads were good. We drove but 1 horse, which took us our day's journey from morning till evening, about 6 hours, exclusive of 2 hours' rest in the middle of the day. I do not suppose we made above 30 or 35 miles on an average. Each day we had a fresh horse. As I have said already, I could see nothing of the country. I only know that it was level, and that several times we had to cross large rivers in ferry boats. The inns were clean and comfortable. In 1 or 2 of the larger towns they were quite sumptuous, and the food was good and well cooked. The same wonderful health and grace and beauty prevailed everywhere. I found myself an object of great interest, so much so that the driver told me that he had to keep our route secret, and at times to go places that were not directly on our road, in order to avoid the press that would otherwise have awaited us. Every evening I had a reception, and grew heartily tired of having to say the same things over and over again in answer to the same questions, but it was impossible to be angry with people whose manners were so delightful. They never once asked after my health, or even whether I was fatigued with my journey, but their first question was almost invariably an inquiry after my temper, the naivete of which astonished me till I became used to it. One day, being tired and cold and weary of saying the same thing over and over again, I turned a little brusquely on my questioner, and said that I was exceedingly cross, and that I could hardly feel in a worse humor with myself and everyone else than at that moment. To my surprise, I was met with the kindest expressions of condolence, and heard it buzzed about the room that I was in an ill temper, whereupon people began to give me nice things to smell and to eat, which really did seem to have some temper-mending quality about them, for I soon felt pleased and was at once congratulated upon being better. The next morning, 2 or 3 people sent their servants to the hotel with sweetmeats and inquiries whether I had quite recovered from my ill humor. On receiving the good things, I felt in half a mind to be ill-tempered every evening, but I disliked the condolences and the inquiries, and found it most comfortable to keep my natural temper, which is smooth enough generally. Among those who came to visit me were some who had received a liberal education at the colleges of Unreason and taken the highest degrees in hypothetics, which are their principal study. These gentlemen had now settled down to various employments in the country, as straighteners, managers, and cashiers at the musical banks, priests of religion or whatnot, and carrying their education with them, they diffused a leaven of culture throughout the country. I naturally questioned them about many of the things which puzzled me since my arrival. I inquired what was the object and meaning of the statues which I had seen upon the plateau of the pass. I was told that they dated from a very remote period, and that there were several other such groups in the country, but none so remarkable as the one which I had seen. They had a religious origin, having been designed to propitiate the gods of deformity and disease. In former times it had been the custom to make expeditions over the ranges and to capture the ugliest of Chaldic's ancestors whom they could find, in order to sacrifice them in the presence of these deities, and thus avert ugliness and disease from the Erewhonians themselves. It had been whispered, but my informant assured me untruly, that centuries ago they had even offered up some of their own people who were ugly or out of health, in order to make examples of them. These detestable customs, however, had been long discontinued, neither was there any present observance of the statues. I had the curiosity to inquire what would be done to any of Chaldic's tribe if they crossed over into Erewhon. I was told that nobody knew, inasmuch as such a thing had not happened for ages. They would be too ugly to be allowed to go at large, but not so much so as to be criminally liable. Their offense in having come would be a moral one, but they would be beyond the straightener's art. Possibly they would be consigned to the hospital for incurable bores, and made to work at being bored for so many hours a day by the Erewhonian inhabitants of the hospital, who are extremely impatient of one another's boredom, but would soon die if they had no one whom they might bore. In fact, that they would be kept as professional bores. When I heard this, it occurred to me that some rumors of its substance might perhaps have become current among Chaldic's people, for the agony of his fear had been too great to have been inspired by the mere dread of being burnt alive before the statues. I also questioned them about the Museum of Old Machines, and the cause of the apparent retrogression in all arts, sciences, and inventions. I learnt that about 400 years previously, the state of mechanical knowledge was far beyond our own, and was advancing with prodigious rapidity, until one of the most learned professors of hypothetics wrote an extraordinary book, from which I propose to give extracts later on, proving that the machines were ultimately destined to supplant the race of man, and to become instinct with a vitality as different from, and superior to, that of animals, as animal to vegetable life. So convincing was his reasoning or unreasoning to this effect that he carried the country with him, and they made a clean sweep of all machinery that had not been in use for more than 271 years, which period was arrived at after a series of compromises, and strictly forbade all further improvements and inventions under pain of being considered in the eye of the law to be laboring under typhus fever, which they regard as one of the worst of all crimes. This is the only case in which they have confounded mental and physical diseases, and they do it even here as by an avowed legal fiction. I became uneasy when I remembered about my watch, but they comforted me with the assurance that transgression in this matter was so now unheard of that the law could afford to be lenient towards an utter stranger, especially towards one who had such a good character, they meant physique, and such beautiful light hair. Moreover, the watch was a real curiosity, and would be a welcome addition to the Metropolitan collection, so they did not think I need let it trouble me seriously. I will write, however, more fully upon this subject when I deal with the Colleges of Unreason and the Book of the Machines. In about a month from the time of our starting, I was told that our journey was nearly over. The bandage was now dispensed with, for it seemed impossible that I should ever be able to find my way back without being captured. Then we rolled merrily along through the streets of a handsome town, and got onto a long, broad, and level road with poplar trees on either side. The road was raised slightly above the surrounding country, and had formerly been a railway. The fields on either side were in the highest conceivable cultivation, but the harvest and also the vintage had been already gathered. The weather had got cooler more rapidly than could be quite accounted for by the progress of the season, so I rather thought that we must have been making away from the sun, and were some degrees farther from the equator than when we started. Even here the vegetation showed that the climate was a hot one, yet there was no lack of vigor among the people. On the contrary, they were a very hardy race, and capable of great endurance. For the 100th time I thought that, take them all round, I had never seen their equals in respect of physique, and they looked as good-natured as they were robust. The flowers were for the most part over, but their absence was in some measure compensated for by a profusion of delicious fruit, closely resembling the figs, peaches, and pears of Italy and France. I saw no wild animals, but birds were plentiful, and much as in Europe, but not tame as they had been on the other side of the ranges. They were shot at with a crossbow, and with arrows, gunpowder being unknown, or at any rate not in use. We were now nearing the Metropolis, and I could see great towers and fortifications and lofty buildings that looked like palaces. I began to be nervous as to my reception, but I had got on very well so far, and resolved to continue upon the same plan as hitherto, namely to behave just as though I were in England until I saw that I was making a blunder, and then to say nothing till I could gather how the land lay. We drew nearer and nearer. The news of my approach had got abroad, and there was a great crowd collected on either side of the road, who greeted me with marks of most respectful curiosity, keeping me bowing constantly in acknowledgment from side to side. When we were about a mile off, we were met by the mayor and several councillors, among whom was a venerable old man, who was introduced to me by the mayor, for I suppose I should call him, as the gentleman who had invited me to his house. I bowed deeply, and told him how grateful I felt him, and how gladly I would accept his hospitality. He forbade me to say more, and pointing to his carriage, which was close at hand, he motioned me to a seat therein. I again bowed profoundly to the mayor and councillors, and drove off with my entertainer, whose name was Senoj Nosnibor. After about half a mile, the carriage turned off the main road, and we drove under the walls of the town till we reached a palazzo on a slight eminence and just on the outskirts of the city. This was Senoj Nosnibor's house, and nothing can be imagined finer. It was situated near the magnificent and venerable ruins of the old railway station, which formed an imposing feature from the gardens of the house. The grounds, some 10 or dozen acres in extent, were laid out in terraced gardens, one above the other, with flights of broad steps ascending and descending the declivity of the garden. On these steps there were statues of most exquisite workmanship. Besides the statues there were vases filled with various shrubs that were new to me, and on either side of the flights of steps there were rows of old cypresses and cedars with grassy alleys between them. Then came choice vineyards and orchards of fruit trees in full bearing. The house itself was approached by a courtyard, and round it was a corridor onto which rooms opened, as at Pompeii. In the middle of the court there was a bath and a fountain. Having passed the court, we came to the main body of the house, which was 2 stories in height. The rooms were large and lofty. Perhaps at first they looked rather bare of furniture, but in hot climates people generally keep their rooms more bare than they do in colder ones. I missed also the sight of a grand piano or some similar instrument, there being no means of producing music in any of the rooms save the larger drawing-room, where there was half a dozen large bronze gongs, which the ladies used occasionally to beat out at random. It was not pleasant to hear them. but I have heard quite as unpleasant music both before and since. Mr. Nosnibor took me through several spacious rooms till we reached a boudoir where were his wife and daughters, of whom I had heard from the interpreter. Mrs. Nosnibor was about 40 years old and still handsome, but she had grown very stout. Her daughters were in the prime of youth and exquisitely beautiful. I gave the preference almost at once to the younger, whose name was Erewhon, for the eldest sister was haughty, while the younger had a very winning manner. Mrs. Nosnibor received me with a perfection of courtesy, so that I must have indeed been shy and nervous if I had not at once felt welcome. Scarcely was the ceremony of my introduction well completed before a servant announced that dinner was ready in the next room. I was scarcely hungry, and the dinner was beyond all praise. Can the reader wonder that I began to consider myself in excellent quarters? That man embezzled money, thought I to myself. Impossible. But I noticed that my host was uneasy during the whole meal, and that he ate nothing but a little bread and milk. Towards the end of dinner there came a tall, lean man with a black beard, to whom Mr. Nosnibor and the whole family paid great attention. He was the family straightener. With this gentleman Mr. Nosnibor retired into another room, from which there presently proceeded a sound of weeping and wailing. I could hardly believe my ears, but in a few minutes I got to know for a certainty that they came from Mr. Nosnibor himself. "Poor papa," said Erewhon, as she helped herself composedly to the salt. "How terribly he has suffered." "Yes," answered her mother, "but I think he is quite out of danger now." Then they went on to explain to me the circumstances of the case, and the treatment with which the straightener had prescribed, and how successful he had been. All which I will reserve for another chapter, and put rather in the form of a general summary of the opinions current upon these subjects than in the exact words in which the facts were delivered to me. The reader, however, is earnestly requested to believe that both in this next chapter and in those that follow it I have endeavored to adhere most conscientiously to the strictest accuracy, and that I have never willingly misrepresented, though I may have sometimes failed to understand all the bearings of an opinion or custom. This is the end of chapters 8 and 9 of Erewhon by Samuel Butler. Thank you for listening.